Thanks for having me. Good to see you.
Wow,
I
this is
just
the
drove
first.
by your
There's a
church.
first time for everything. Go ahead.
I just drove by your church tonight. I could have come to the dinner. Sorry.
There you go. Life is funny sometimes. And yes, you could have. Although I tell you, it is very interesting that we've got weather possibly coming tonight. And so, thanks be to God for Zoom. Like, it's really interesting how things work out. The fact that you're joining us on Zoom is probably going to be a blessing to people who might be worried about weather. So yeah, thanks be to God. Y'all, can I introduce David real quick? So wonderful that you're with us, David. And again, this format is experimental. I'm sure that it's not ideal, but I'm all about progress, not perfection. So I'm happy right now. Okay, David Peters is a wonderful friend of mine. In fact, what I want to say, and I don't know David as well as I want to. That's probably true for most people, right? But I do want to say that, like, coming back to Austin, making that decision, to come to St. George's and to leave Tyler, one of the real motivations for me for all of that really was the clergy in this convocation, the clergy, Episcopal priests in Austin, in and around Austin. I'm going to look at the TV. I'm going to look at you beautiful people through the TV, if that works. Yeah, such amazing clergy in this city, smart people, funny people, people who love Jesus, gifted people. David Peters is at the top of that list. So I can definitely say that David is one of many reasons why I wanted to move back to Austin. Yes. So I wanted to say that. I also wanted to say that David and I have done stuff together. He came to Tyler once and engaged in his work that I'm going to talk about in a moment about veterans issues. That was pretty awesome. And David is a well-known, well-recognized leader in veteran circles. And David, if I misspeak, please jump in. I need all the help I can get. He's well recognized. He's a recognized leader nationally and maybe internationally when it comes to veterans issues, thinking about trauma, VA type issues, et cetera, mental health. David and I have a shared past, I believe. We both have been in the world of Presbyterianism on the East Coast. Is that right? Did I word that properly? That's kind of interesting. And for both of us, that is in our distant past. We saw greener pastures and got to those as soon as we could. Yes. And then, David is a church planter. Another thing we have in common. It is really amazing. He's a church planter in the Austin area. And then the last thing that I'd like to say about David, I believe, is that he is the author of multiple books, all of which can be purchased on Amazon.com, or better yet, book people. Oh yeah. And the one that I have read and given to other people is a book called Post-Traumatic Jesus, Reading the Gospel with the Wounded. And full disclosure, true confession, had I remembered about that book about eight weeks ago, we probably would have been reading that one instead of this one. So, oh well. I highly recommend that book, Post-Traumatic Jesus. He has also written other books, including, this is amazing, check out this title, Accidental: Rebuilding a Life After Taking One. There's other books as well, but I talk too much, so I'm going to hand it over to David Peters, my good friend. David, welcome. Oh, did we lose him? Oh.
I'm back.
You're back. Oh, who is your friend?
This is Boris Blue, the bishop here. Bishop Blue.
Excellent. David, it's all you, my brother. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for saying nice things about me. It's I have so many nice things to say about you, Father Matt, and thankful for your ministry to me over these years. And it's good to know you. It's good to know the people of St. George's when I was between jobs, as they say. I attended there Christmas Eve. It's really, really weird to be a priest on Christmas Eve and attend a different service. And I found that to be the most comforting thing I could do on that night. So I'm thankful for all of you that made that happen a number of years ago. My introduction of this opening part of Bessel van der Kolk's monumental work. I could sort of hear you talking about the book. I tuned in early to see if you were talking about me, and you weren't, thankfully. But you were talking about Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, probably the most popular and well-known book about trauma on the market today. The weird thing about Bessel van der Kolk for me is that that he really takes the classic understanding of trauma that most people kind of think about and runs with it to try to make a case for a deeper understanding of trauma in places that don't get as much credit or recognition. And yet, often it's that the veteran who's throwing things and yelling things image that sticks in people's mind when it comes to PTSD. He does make the case for trauma and PTSD to be an equal opportunity pathology for all kinds of people from all kinds of situations. His introduction does start with this Vietnam veteran, this troubled man who has troubled others and is troubling himself and is deeply troubled, not unlike many of the folks that Jesus met in his earthly pilgrimage here, people that were suffering, in need of healing. And his exploration of this patient really exposes the gap between wanting to help someone and our ability to really help someone who's suffering that way. I think it's good for Christians to kind of know the links between our faith and the psychological community or the world that Bessel van der Kolk lives in the medical community. Christians have always been a healthcare organization. Christianity has always been a healthcare organization. There's a book called Christianity and the Rise of Healthcare, and it points that early Christians offered their healing, the anointing with oil, the healing prayers, the comfort care that was given to victims of all sorts of traumas and traumatic events for free. Unlike most of the medical systems of the first century, Christians insisted that since grace was freely given, that should be given free to all. And so early Christianity has always been trying to help people recover from big setbacks and pain and suffering in life. The word trauma appears in the New Testament once or twice. There's a number of different words for wound, to be wounded, to have a wound in Greek and in the New Testament and in the Old Testament as well. But the word trauma shows up as a word for wound in the Bible. And that's all it means. It just means a wound. We use it metaphorically in many ways to speak of the soul wounds of life. But the wounded soul has always been a thing that humans have known about. And Bessel writes about that in his book, that the history of trauma studies goes all the way back to the first traumatic moments, which in human history have been numerous. The word veteran is a word that means old man. And I think it speaks to the fact that many veterans, people that have experienced war, are older than most people because they were serving in prior wars, but also speaks to the nature how that trauma changed them to make them seem older when they really weren't that old. Most people that fight in wars are quite young, relatively, and yet they seem to be older. So here, even in the very baked into our language, is the notion that traumatic events change people's identity, change who they are, change how they see the world, how they view the world. In fact, Bessel says that traumatic events change the way we see the world. Every book that's been written in the old days, from the Iliad to the Odyssey to the Old Testament to the New Testament and others, speak to the universality of traumatic experience. If you think about the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and the traumatic events of that book, they abound. They're on every page, just about. My cat is definitely a friend of mine in trauma. I wish I had him many years ago. He's my first pet, so he has the run of the place. And I think this idea of trauma and trauma studies gained ground because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most people nowadays know what PTSD is just from reading the newspaper, listening to the news, watching TV, watching movies. Most movies and TV shows that are produced today have some sort of trauma thread through them, a way of showing that these kind of things change people's character and their identity. One of the greatest monumental, probably scene-changing books of the last 20 years has been the Achilles in Vietnam, Trauma and the Undoing of Character by Jonathan Shea. A book that sort of parallels the lives of the characters in the Iliad and Hector and Achilles and others as they express their grief and trauma in those ancient poems, and saying it sounds a lot like veterans today. So this emphasis on veterans has always been part of trauma, but Bessel van der Kolk and others point to this shared affinity for traumatic events, which goes across every age, every life, every. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. He's hungry for some food that I gave him, but he wants more of the same. When I was teaching a class at Seminary Southwest on ministry to people with PTSD, and for chaplains and therapists as they were in the training, and I had the classic book, "The Body Keeps the Score," ready to roll in that course, and that spring, right before I taught the class in the fall, some articles came out about Bessel van der Kolk himself and how he had traumatized many people that worked for him at the center that he founded. And he was subsequently removed from that post. You can read all about the controversy and who said what and who did what, if you like, if you're into drama and workplace drama. But I started to search for another book about trauma because I knew this was the standard that everyone's going to use and everyone's going to think about. But the other book that came to me and someone recommended was Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery. Judith Herman starts at a different place than Bessel van der Kolk. Judith Herman mostly studied survivors of incest, childhood incest. And in her work as an academic and as a physician and therapist. And so her approach to trauma starts with the history of trauma, which I found to be really fascinating. She starts with Sigmund Freud, well, starts with some others, but starts with Sigmund Freud, who is trying to figure out why the young women that are coming to his practice of psychotherapy, which is experimental and new, and people are really, trying to figure out what's wrong with these young women. They are often of a higher class. They're privileged in many ways. They come from good families, but they are acting out with symptoms that are really, really disturbing. They are manifesting symptoms that we would easily recognize today as psychosis and all sorts of disassociation and withdrawal and isolation and suicidal ideations and thoughts and impetuses and attempts. So he's talking to these young women and finding that nearly in every single case, they have been sexually molested, assaulted, raped by family members. And the horror of that speaks to a much more widespread problem in the society, which at that time is just about what we might call the Victorian society today, pointing to just the widespread nature of this sort of abuse and how, and he starts to write about this and say, the reason these young women are having these problems is because they have been assaulted in this way repeatedly by a trusted person in their life. And this is producing these kinds of symptoms. And we need to focus on this. His colleagues rejected that notion very quickly and said, that can't be it. They must have some other conflict with their mother or other things. And Freud eventually abandons the trauma theory for these suffering young people. Many of them quit his practice after a while because they realize that he doesn't listen to them. He doesn't take their stories seriously. In fact, Freud drills down into their sexual arousal and things like that in this abuse. He focuses on that instead of the actual horrific betrayal that they have experienced. Judith Herman presents this in very stark terms in her book, saying that this is where trauma studies went off the rails, so to speak. That all sorts of other explanations were used to try to figure out why people were behaving the ways they were behaving, when in fact, it was often the kind of trauma that is associated with betrayal of a deep-rooted trust in a person that you're supposed to be able to trust. And for me, her book is very useful in this way to try to understand why so many people today exhibit trauma symptoms for traumas that are not easily recognizable or believed in our society. Judith Herman makes it really clear that in order for healing to happen for someone who's suffered from traumatic experiences, they have to be believed. The thing about veterans is we get believed. In fact, people believe our stories even if they're not true. We say something that happened to us in a war, they're going to believe us. And veterans are known to embellish certain stories at times and put ourselves in situations that maybe we didn't experience directly, but somebody else did, and we heard about it, and we thought that might benefit us. That does happen from time to time. I don't know if it's as widespread as we know or can prove, and we can't really hunt down who's right and who's wrong about these things. But ultimately, it is that we are believed as a community that a lot of good healing has happened. Survivors of sexual assault, of family sexual assault, clergy sexual abuse, and others, where nobody believes them, have a much lower recovery rate and ability to heal. There's something about the community believing your story that is part of the healing. And Judith Herman's approach to that, to me, is a good addition to Bessel van der Kolk's foundational work when it comes to trauma and how it's located in our bodies. One of my roles as a priest is to help people think theologically about life, to try to take their life experiences of traumatic events and connect them to their faith in some way. The first thing I try to do is get people into some sort of healthcare, whether that's talking to their doctor about the trauma they suffered, a licensed counselor, a therapist, someone that they can trust in that way. But then as they do that and start to unpack some of the stuff that's in this book that you're reading, and then to sort of connect that with their faith. I talked earlier about the betrayal of trust that the crimes and horrific traumas of incest and childhood sexual assault bring. When you can't trust the family members in your life that are supposed to protect you, who can you trust? And to me, that's a very rich theological area to explore and to heal in that the very basis of our faith is trust. In fact, a synonym for the word faith is trust. You can sometimes substitute in the creed the word believe for the word trust. They're not completely overlapping, but I think they overlap enough that you could do it and get away with it. I trust in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I trust in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. We trust. All these trust words that are right in deep in our faith, to me, is a place where the church can offer healing to people who have been through trauma. And pretty much everybody has to some degree or another. Most people have a scale of trauma in their minds, and Freud certainly did, and others from the history of psychotherapy that Bessel van der Kolk exposes as missing the point of what people were really suffering. In that they said that wasn't so bad, that's not so bad. Only these traumas count. And I want, if I can just say to you, as people that have lived in this world, your traumas matter to God, and they ought to matter to us as well. The wounds of your life are ultimately the places in which God will probably work the most, and that is not a great thought to think sometimes, that we do have to be open to healing happening in those wounded places of our life, even when we'd rather conceal them from people. And there's sometimes good reasons to conceal our wounds and that nobody will believe us. But ultimately, I've found that so much of veterans' trauma and trauma of people that I've known has a lot to do with this betrayal of trust, this betrayal of loyalty, and not so much the big booms and explosions of life and the things that make it into the movies, but often those betrayals, those bodily harms, and the threat of it that have happened to so many people on this planet. That is often the source of the greatest wounds, the greatest trauma. And that is a place where God is. God is in those places as well as in the places that are happy and full of butterflies and light. Ultimately, that is a place where God is too. So that's my little intro to the study of trauma. I think you'll find a rich body of literature in most of the trauma books leading up to that diagnosis of PTSD. But once PTSD is fairly established as an anxiety disorder, because it makes you anxious all the time, ready for the next threat, a lot of the research, or at least in the popular understanding of it, kind of stopped. And the new avenues of research for PTSD lie in this movement from the personal to the political. I don't mean like who to vote for. I mean that when something happens to one person and they disclose that to someone in private, part of the healing that has to happen, or it won't really be healing, is that the larger community addresses the source of that problem. We look at an issue of the sexual harassment and assault of women by men in positions of power. Unless we as a community come together and say, enough is enough, we're not going to overlook this anymore, we're going to address it and deal with it, that abuse continues, and the people who report it or who witness to it or bear witness to it realize that nobody really believes that. And so we can see how healing has to have a political movement in it as well. And by that, I mean a community movement to try to change the way we see it and the way we deal with it. I think the church has done that to a large degree when it comes to clergy and leader sexual abuse in the church. We no longer sweep those things under the rug, trying very hard to address them so that healing can happen, reconciliation can happen, and ultimately the victims can be believed and they can start that journey of healing. But so many other places in our world have not cared enough to do that. And I think that we are in great need of that as a culture and a society. That's my little talk on the opening part of this book. And I thank you for listening.
David, thank you. So fun. Y'all, one of the things that I should have probably said earlier on, maybe before David spoke, is that I already said that it's okay if you haven't read the book. No problem. It's just great to be with you. And I think you'll still benefit. But I should have said earlier that for those of you who are reading, there's a sense in which the material that we're discussing tonight is indeed part one of the book, The Rediscovery of Trauma. And so, yeah, I think David was assuming that, and well done, sir. Yeah, 3 chapters, lessons from Vietnam veterans, right? So actually when I read that I was motivated to call David and ask him to be one of our speakers. 2, revolutions in understanding mind and brain. Side note, is the mind the same thing as the brain? No. Nope, it's not. The brain is our body. Our body includes the brain. Mind is something else. Not everyone in our world believes that minds are real, but maybe we can talk about that later. Chapter 3 is called Looking into the Brain, the Neuroscience Revolution. I took some notes, but let me just ask y'all, any comments, any questions for David, anything that you'd like to discuss?
Well, yeah, hi, Dr. August. Yeah, Vandercoat's book doesn't take into, it was written so long ago, doesn't take into account all the data theory. I don't know if you're familiar with that, with the Vegas versus the plants, it's primarily Stephen Porges.
So one thing I'm going to need to do, August, is sort of translate your question, which I can tell is going to be a challenge.
Work in neurophysiology and neuropsychology.
Good. I don't know if David can hear you, so I'm going to speak into the mic.
I can't.
And sort of try to
But
translate.
I hear your voice, and it sounds like a great voice. That's all I can hear is your voice.
It is a great voice. And you can hear me right now, right?
I can.
Okay, great. So polyvagal theory. So Van der Kolk's book is incomplete. He's given it one perspective, but I do have to just say that August is a clinical psychologist with a PhD from the University of Texas. So no pressure. Have you heard of this theory, David?
Oh yeah, I've heard of it. I'm not an expert in it, and I if you'd like to say anything, yeah, I'm a.
No, it's just that I think it's an important addition.
Come up here. Come sit in this chair. Y'all, I warned you that this was a bit experimental. And one day we'll invest in some proper equipment, maybe, but have a seat. This is great. Yeah, you can sit in that chair.
When Van der Kolk first published The Body Keeps the Score, Stephen Porges, who's like the researcher who came up with polyvagal theory, wasn't widely known, and Van der Kolk's work doesn't include that. But I think it's a really, important addition to the study of trauma, and the whole thing, how the fight, flight, freeze, the survival system works, and the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and I guess it's the neurophysiological arousal that Van der Kolk does talk some about, but not as much as had he written the book after Porges was published. So, so anyway, that's it.
Thank you. Very good.
Really,
any thoughts, David?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist as these are. Certainly, I just read the books and hear things. And as a patient myself of these therapies, I get to experience them firsthand. But any kind of therapy or therapeutic theory, to me, that's helpful is the one that really addresses what's happening to people and how they can help, and they can get back to living, as Bessel van der Kolk says, living in relationship with other people. I think that when people are in those trauma responses, when there's no real threat, like there was in their initial incident, none of us can really function relationally the way that we used to or really could. I noticed in my own life, when I was coming back from Iraq, I went to a hospital to work as a hospital chaplain. That was my assignment. And we would spend like half the day visiting patients in the hospital, that weren't there to see a chaplain. They were there to see the doctors and nurses. But we would happen to be there and chat with them and learn from them and hear their stories as living human documents themselves. And then we would have a time of reflection in the afternoon. We'd kind of reflect on what we heard and think theologically about their lives and stories, and then learn a little bit about what they're healing from and how that might be facilitated better. It was called clinical pastoral education. It started in the 1920s to try to help pastors and theological types to really be able to speak to people that were suffering from mental illness and be able to care for them and relate to them in a more wholesome way than just preaching at them or telling them to act better or something like that. But in this program, I was describing some patient visits to my colleagues. I would say, I walked in, I noticed he was propped up on his bed. He had his glasses on, he was reading something. He didn't look up when I walked in, but I didn't feel threatened by him in any way, I was saying. And I would say this enough that a couple of actually the supervisor pointed that out and said, do you feel like people are threatening to you when you walk in their hospital room? Do you feel like that's a threat to you? Well, say more about that, kind of thing. And I realized that I saw everybody as a huge threat to me after spending a year in Iraq, where they would tell us over and over again, like, if you're around pretty much anybody, except for the people that you know the best, you have to be ready for them to try to kill you at any moment. Like, you just have to be ready for that. And however you prepare for that is your business. But if you don't know the person really well, like your top 5 people or whatever, or 10, you should be ready for them to try to kill you and be ready for that. And I was a chaplain, hardly a militaristic figure in the battle space or in the army unit. But that had a huge effect on me, seeing the world as a threat, seeing other people as a threat, not so much to maybe my physical harm, but to some sort of other means of betrayal or some other break of trust. So as someone that was suffering from symptoms of PTSD at that very time, to see the world, that really speaks to that bodily reaction we have in certain situations, that polyvagal theory and any other theory that addresses our, response, our bodily response and neurological response, but especially that feeling you get when you're around someone that you can't trust. People have this to greater degrees than others. Those of us that have a little more privilege, like me as a white man in America, I have a little more privilege, and less people do that to me than perhaps other people in our communities. But I still have that a little bit inside of me. And I think that to me, that's how I kind of experience that. So healing, means how do you learn how to trust people again? That is something churches are actively working on. You're working on that right there in that room tonight. You're working on that when you meet in Zoom meetings. You're working on, can I give the gift of trust to another person? And they can carry that for me, even if we've not been through the shit together, even if we haven't had the same exact experiences. It's another thing Bessel van der Kolk says, that all these units, these groups of guys that he would meet with for a while, would always give him like an honorary patch or a uniform, because he was one of them suddenly. And that's the only way they could see him as a healing source, was if he was one of them. He noticed that. And I think that churches are schools of love, experiments in how to learn how to trust God again, how to trust each other. If you're going to church in 2023, you've seen some real tough things in church life. You've experienced them yourself. There is no reason for anybody to be going to church today to fit in culturally, or to get a good job, or to be accepted by society, or, there's no, like, maybe there was in the past a good reason to go to church that was like, you could be a member of the community and a person of standing or something. But those days are over. If you're going to church, you're going because
Hey, David,
something deep inside you, that gift of trust. Yeah.
Apparently you've never been to Tyler, Texas.
Are they still going to church there for
They are.
Cultural
anyway. Really, really great. And God bless them. I mean,
not in this area.
Not in this area. Yep, that's true. Y'all, so it's I'm mindful of the fact that we've got maybe 5 or 10 folks on Zoom. I wonder if there's anyone on Zoom who might have a comment, anyone with us joining online who might have a comment, a question for David. Yeah. This is a great opportunity for me to improve my Zoom skills, by the way, because I'm taking notes and there's some things I can do better next time. Anyone on Zoom? It's great to see you guys. Not everyone is visible to me at the moment. I know that there's other folks on Zoom. How about anyone in the room?
Oh, Samantha? Maybe Samantha?
You can come up here or I can
Okay,
translate
I
for
saw
you.
unmuted.
Come on up. Although it's probably easier to translate than August. Oh my gosh.
Intelligent than August comment. For years, our church had a project with a group home for foster girls. And these were all young women who had been removed from their homes because of neglect and abuse. I'm sorry, I get emotional when I remember them. And when you think about it, every single one of them had had that primary betrayal of trust by somebody they should count on to take care of them. In some cases, they'd even been separated from siblings. And I don't know, I like to think that the church had a part of their healing because we were a part of a family to them. But in some ways, you know, we've maybe kept track of some of them, and the story of their lives is just so hard. I don't know why I brought that up.
Well, I'm glad you did. Yeah. And I'm going to translate this one. Yeah, what Spencer heard you say, among other things, David, is that where the wound is deepest, there God dwells. Yeah.
Yeah, Jesus introduces himself with his wounds when he meets the disciples after his crucifixion and resurrection. And we know he has these visible wounds that Thomas wants to touch and see for himself, but he probably has invisible ones too. You don't get crucified without having psychological damage. I think that would be pretty fair to recognize. And I try to meditate on that sometimes, that Jesus has the wounds of the soul. And you can hear that in the words that he says from the cross, that ultimately he does not speak so much of his physical pain as the pain of betrayal and loss. And these are the things that he's wrestling with in the Garden of Gethsemane. These are the things that he's wrestling with Peter and others after his resurrection.
Oh,
and
I
so
think my computer died. I thought, oh, hey, David. Hey, David.
yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Hey, David. Oh, you know what? I think weather's happening. David, can you hear me?
I can. Yes. Yeah. Loud and clear.
Oh, he's muted. Oh,
Oh, I can hear you.
oh, hang on. I think I know what to do. Thanks to Liam. No. Huh.
I'll leave and come back.
Okay, y'all. I hear some weather. This is a weird providential thing. Okay. I know my battery's low, but I just don't know why I can't hear David.
I left and came back. I don't know if that's better.
Jenny.
It was fun while it lasted.
Yes. Hello, everyone on Zoom. Thanks for joining me. They can't hear. You can say anything you want, and they won't leave this room.
Let's see. I'm going to look at the chat. Hang on real quick.
Yeah, there's.
Do you mind? I'm going to look at. Mhm.
I can hear you too. I see and hear you.
Oh, great. I think everyone hears us except
I can
for
hear you.
us. All right.
We hear the whole thing. We hear online and we
Everyone.
hear the church.
Yeah. You know what? So, Dale Curry, can you hear me right now?
I can hear you,
Carolyn,
Bob.
can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Samantha
Yeah.
Stevens, can you hear me right now? No, they can't hear us. Okay.
Samantha,
Y'all, I have got
Samantha said she can hear you.
7:40. This was good.
Good timing.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Thank you, Lord, for this evening. Thank you for the Zoom technology while it lasted. Thank you for your servant, David Peters. Thank you, Lord, for your wounds. Thank you for these friends. Be with us during the rest of this season of Lent, Lord. Thank you for this gathering and the food and all of it. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Good night.
Take care, everyone. Blessings.
Thank you, David, for your speech.
Yeah, thank you.
Yay.